A tired single father sits quietly in seat 12F, ignored by everyone. His worn jacket hides a secret past. Then military jets land, and an F-22 commander boards the plane. He salutes and says 5 words that shock everyone: "Sir, welcome back, Viper 1." The cabin falls silent. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates. Among the crowd, a man walked alone, unnoticed by almost everyone around him. His name was David Mitchell, and he carried only a small backpack over his shoulder. David was in his late 30s, with tired eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. His jeans were faded, his jacket worn at the edges, and his boots scuffed from years of use. He looked like any other tired traveler trying to get home after a long journey. At the boarding gate for Flight 427 to Washington, D.C., passengers lined up with their tickets ready. Business travelers tapped on their phones. Families juggled luggage and excited children. Nobody paid attention to the quiet man at the back of the line. "Boarding pass, please," the gate agent said with a practiced smile. David handed her his phone with the digital ticket displayed. "Mr. Mitchell, you're in seat 27B today. Economy class, aisle seat." "Thank you," David replied softly. Just as he was about to walk down the jet bridge, the agent's computer beeped. She frowned, tapped a few keys, then looked up with surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. There's been a last-minute change. We've had to move several passengers due to a weight distribution issue. You've been reassigned to seat 12F. David raised an eyebrow. "First class?" "Yes, sir. I apologize for the confusion. Please proceed to the front cabin." David nodded and continued down the jet bridge. He wasn't the type to make a fuss about seating arrangements. He just wanted to get home to his daughter, Emma, who was waiting for him. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin gleamed with leather seats and ambient lighting. The flight attendants smiled warmly as passengers settled in. David made his way down the narrow aisle, aware that a few passengers were glancing at him with curiosity. In seat 12E sat a young woman in military uniform. Her name tag read Harris. She had short brown hair tied back neatly and wore the insignia of an Air Force lieutenant. She looked up as David approached and gestured to the window seat beside her. "That's you?" she asked, her tone neutral but assessing. "Looks like it," David replied, sliding past her to reach seat 12F. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and buckled his seatbelt. The backpack was old, military-issue canvas, with patches sewn onto it that had faded over time. One patch, barely visible on the corner flap, showed a simple design, a single star with wings. Lieutenant Harris glanced at the backpack, then at David. "You serve?" she asked. "A long time ago," David answered. "What branch?" "Air Force." She nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer, and returned to scrolling through her tablet. David looked out the window at the ground crew preparing the plane for departure. Across the aisle, in seat 12C, sat a man in an expensive suit. His name was Richard Palmer, a corporate executive who clearly believed first class was his natural habitat. He had been on a phone call since boarding, speaking loudly about quarterly earnings and mergers. Richard ended his call and glanced over at David. His expression showed a flicker of judgment, taking in the worn clothing and weathered appearance. "Excuse me, flight attendant." Richard called out, his voice carrying through the cabin. A young flight attendant named Sarah approached. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Richard lowered his voice, but not enough. "I think there might be some confusion. This is the first-class cabin." Sarah followed his gaze to David, then smiled politely. "Yes, sir. All our passengers today have been properly seated according to their boarding passes." "I see," Richard said, clearly unconvinced. "Just seemed unusual, that's all." Sarah maintained her professional smile and moved on to assist other passengers. David had heard the entire exchange but showed no reaction. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Lieutenant Harris surprised him by speaking again. "I'm stationed at Andrews," she said. "Fighter Training Division." "That's good work," David replied. "You ever fly?" she asked. "Once or twice." "What did you fly?" David paused. "Whatever they needed me to fly." There was something in his tone that made Harris study him more carefully. Before she could ask another question, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Reynolds. We're cleared for takeoff and should have a smooth flight to Washington, D.C. today. Flight time will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The engines roared to life, and the plane accelerated down the runway. David watched the ground fall away beneath them, the airport growing smaller until it disappeared into a patchwork of fields and highways below. Once they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their service. Sarah came by with a tray of drinks. "Can I offer you something to drink, sir?" she asked David. "Just water, please." "And you, ma'am?" she asked Lieutenant Harris. "Coffee, black." As Sarah moved on to serve other passengers, Richard spoke up again, this time directing his words toward the cabin in general. "You know what I love about first class? You meet such interesting people. CEOs, politicians, celebrities." He paused, then added with false casualness, "though I suppose the standards have changed." A few passengers chuckled uncomfortably. Lieutenant Harris frowned but said nothing. David simply closed his eyes and rested his head against the window. About 30 minutes into the flight, an elderly woman in row 10 dropped her reading glasses. They clattered to the floor and slid under the seat in front of her. She struggled with her seatbelt, trying to reach them. David unbuckled immediately and stood up. He walked back 2 rows, bent down, and retrieved the glasses. He wiped them clean with his sleeve before handing them back to her. "Oh, thank you so much, young man," the woman said, her eyes warm with gratitude. "You're welcome, ma'am," David replied. As he returned to his seat, he noticed Richard watching him with a smirk. "Playing the hero," the businessman muttered. David didn't respond. He simply sat down and looked out the window again. Lieutenant Harris, however, had seen the exchange. "That was kind of you," she said quietly. "Just helping someone who needed it," David replied. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." David shrugged. "Most people forget what it's like to need help." Harris considered this for a moment. There was something about this man that didn't match his appearance. Despite his worn clothes and tired demeanor, he carried himself with a certain quiet confidence. His posture was straight, his movements precise and economical. "Can I ask you something?" Harris said. "Sure. That patch on your bag. The star with wings. I don't recognize it." David glanced down at his backpack. "It's from a unit that doesn't exist anymore." "What kind of unit?" "The kind that did jobs nobody else wanted to do." Before Harris could press further, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time the tone was different. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We've received a request from Air Traffic Control to make an unscheduled stop at Andrews Air Force Base for a brief technical inspection. This is purely precautionary and should only delay us by about 20 minutes. We apologize for any inconvenience." Murmurs of confusion and frustration rippled through the cabin. Richard groaned loudly. "You've got to be kidding me. I have a meeting in 2 hours." Harris straightened in her seat, suddenly alert. "Andrews," she murmured. "That's unusual for a commercial flight." David said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly. The plane began its descent, and soon the sprawling military base came into view below. Rows of hangars, neat lines of parked aircraft, and the long runways of one of the country's most important Air Force installations. As they taxied toward a remote area of the tarmac, Harris noticed something that made her heart skip. "Are those F-22s?" David looked where she was pointing. Sure enough, several Raptor fighters were visible in formation near one of the main hangars. Their sleek, angular shapes were unmistakable. The plane came to a complete stop, and the engines wound down. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening outside. Through the windows, they could see two military vehicles approaching the aircraft. The captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have military personnel who need to board briefly. This won't take long." Sarah, the flight attendant, moved to the front cabin door. She looked nervous and excited at the same time. She'd never had military personnel board mid-flight before. The door opened, and cool air rushed into the cabin. Then, three figures in flight suits stepped aboard. The lead officer was a man in his early 40s with sharp features and the bearing of someone who spent more time in the sky than on the ground. His name tag read Cole, and the patches on his flight suit indicated he was a squadron commander. Commander Cole's eyes swept the first-class cabin, scanning each row methodically. Then his gaze locked onto seat 12F. He stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then, in a voice that trembled slightly with emotion, he said, "Sir. Is that really you?" Every head in the cabin turned toward David. The quiet man in the worn jacket slowly stood up. His entire demeanor changed. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened, and suddenly he looked taller, more imposing. "Commander," David said with a slight nod. Cole took 3 quick steps forward and snapped to attention, rendering a crisp military salute. "Sir, I never thought I'd see you again." David returned the salute with equal precision. "At ease, Commander." But Cole remained rigid. "Sir, with respect, permission to speak freely?" "Granted." "You saved my life, sir. 5 years ago, over the northern border. Mission codenamed Broken Arrow. You flew into a hot zone when everyone else said it was suicide. You guided us out when our systems failed and our GPS went dark. If you hadn't come..." His voice cracked. "I wouldn't have made it home to my wife and kids." The cabin was absolutely silent. Even Richard had stopped fidgeting with his phone. Harris stood up slowly, her eyes wide. "Wait. Northern Border Operation. 5 years ago. That was..." She looked at David with dawning realization. "That was classified Black Ops." Cole turned to her. "Lieutenant, this man is the reason half my squadron is still alive today." "But who?" Harris began. Commander Cole turned back to David and said the words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of Colonel David Mitchell. Call sign, Viper 1. The reaction was immediate and electric. Harris gasped. "Viper 1. The Viper 1. Even passengers who knew nothing about military aviation sensed something extraordinary was happening. Cole continued, his voice filled with reverence. "Sir, the base commander has requested permission to render proper honors. We have a formation ready." David closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering himself. When he opened them, there was both sadness and acceptance in his gaze. "Commander, that's not necessary. With respect, sir, it absolutely is necessary. You disappeared after that mission. The brass listed you as MIA. There was talk of casualties that couldn't be confirmed. We never knew what happened to you." David's voice was quiet but firm. "I had a daughter who needed her father more than the Air Force needed another pilot." "Emma," Cole said, and David looked surprised. "Yes, sir. We knew about her. After you vanished, some of us tried to find you. We wanted to make sure you and your girl were okay. We've been okay, David replied. I've been flying under the radar, so to speak. Working odd jobs, staying off the grid. Just trying to be the father she deserves. Sarah, the flight attendant, had tears streaming down her face. She barely understood what was happening, but she understood enough to know this was significant. Richard Palmer looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Cole gestured to the two pilots with him. Sir, this is Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Chen. They're both part of the new generation. We teach them about Viper 1 in training. About the impossible rescue missions you flew. About the lives you saved. Martinez stepped forward. Sir, it's an honor. I joined the Air Force because of stories about you. David looked uncomfortable with the attention. I was just doing my job. No, sir, Cole said firmly. You were doing everyone else's job too. You flew missions so dangerous that they're still classified. You went into airspace where even satellites couldn't track you. And you brought people home. Lieutenant Harris found her voice. I heard stories at the academy. About a ghost pilot who could fly anything, anywhere. I thought it was a legend. Legends are easier than the truth, David said quietly. Cole took a deep breath. Sir, the base commander is General Hawkins. He was your wingman 20 years ago. When air traffic control notified us that a passenger named David Mitchell was on this flight, he ran a check on the travel documents. Your signature, it matched one from an old mission report. He sent us to confirm. And now you have, David said. And now, sir, with your permission, we'd like to give you something you never received. A proper welcome home. David looked past Cole, out the window toward the distant hangars. He was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. Commander, I left because I didn't want the attention. I didn't want the ceremonies or the medals. I just wanted to raise my daughter in peace. We understand that, sir. But some things are bigger than what we want. Some things are about what's right. David met Cole's eyes. In them, he saw genuine respect and gratitude, not just protocol. What did you have in mind? David asked. Cole allowed himself a small smile. An escort, sir. For the remainder of your flight to D.C. Behind them, a young boy in row 8 had been watching everything with wide eyes. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mom, is that man a superhero? He whispered. His mother wiped tears from her eyes. Something like that, honey. Something like that. 10 minutes later, as Flight 427 prepared to take off again, something extraordinary happened. From the main hangar, 4 F-22 Raptors taxied onto the runway. Their engines hummed with barely contained power, and their polished surfaces gleamed in the afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, passengers pressed against the windows, phones out, trying to capture what they were witnessing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and this time there was emotion in it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, and I have never, I repeat, never, had the privilege of what's about to happen. We have been granted a military escort by the United States Air Force in honor of a passenger aboard this flight. I don't know the full story, but I know enough to say we are carrying someone very special today. As the plane lifted off from Andrews, the 4 Raptors rose with it, taking positions around the commercial aircraft. 2 on each side, flying in perfect formation. Inside the cabin, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. Richard Palmer sat slumped in his seat, his face red with shame. He had spent the entire flight judging a man who was more heroic than he could ever hope to be. Lieutenant Harris stood at attention beside her seat, tears running down her face, maintaining a salute. Sarah and the other flight attendants abandoned their service duties, simply standing in awe. And David. David stood at the window in row 12, one hand pressed against the glass, watching the fighters escort them through the sky. Commander Cole had remained on the plane at General Hawkins' request. He stood beside David now. "They're not just escorting you, sir," Cole said quietly. "Those pilots out there, 2 of them were in that squadron you saved 5 years ago. The other 2 are their wingmen. This is their way of saying thank you." David's voice was rough when he spoke. "I don't deserve this. Sir, with respect, you deserve so much more." The elderly woman from row 10, the one whose glasses David had retrieved, made her way forward slowly. She touched his arm gently. "Young man," she said, "my husband was a pilot in Vietnam. He never came home. But men like you are the reason I still believe in heroes. Thank you for your service." David took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, ma'am. And I'm sorry for your loss." She smiled through her tears and returned to her seat. As they flew toward Washington, D.C., the formation held perfect. The Raptors moved like extensions of the commercial aircraft itself, guardian angels with afterburners. Below, people on the ground looked up in wonder. It was rare to see military fighters escorting a civilian plane. Something important must be happening. News helicopters scrambled to get airborne. Social media exploded with photos and videos. #Viper1 began trending within minutes. In the terminal at Reagan National Airport, Emma Mitchell waited by the window. She was 9 years old, with her father's dark hair and quiet intensity. Her grandmother stood beside her, one hand on the girl's shoulder. "When will Daddy's plane land?" Emma asked. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." Then Emma saw them. Through the window, she could make out the distinctive shapes of fighter jets in the distance. "Grandma, look. The planes." Her grandmother squinted. "Oh my. Those are military aircraft." As the formation grew closer, other people in the terminal gathered at the windows. Airport staff stopped what they were doing. Travelers pulled out their phones. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Must be some kind of emergency." "No," an older man in a veteran's cap said, his voice filled with awe. "That's no emergency. That's an honor guard." A news crew was already set up in the terminal, having heard reports of the unusual escort. The reporter spoke urgently into her microphone. "We're here at Reagan National where an unprecedented event is unfolding. A commercial flight is being escorted by 4 F-22 Raptor fighters in what appears to be a military honor formation. We're trying to confirm the reason for this extraordinary display." Inside Flight 427, the captain prepared for landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on final approach to Reagan National. Our escort will be departing shortly. It has been an absolute privilege to be your captain today." Commander Cole shook David's hand one final time. "Sir, General Hawkins wants you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you have only to ask. You have the gratitude of everyone who wears this uniform." "Tell the General I appreciate it," David said. "But what I need most is right here waiting for me." Cole smiled. "Your daughter. Emma, right?" "That's right. She's lucky to have you, sir." "I'm lucky to have her." Lieutenant Harris approached, standing at attention. "Sir, permission to speak?" "Of course, Lieutenant. I just wanted to say, today you reminded me why I joined. Not for the glory or the recognition, but to serve something bigger than myself." "Thank you for that." David nodded. "The uniform is just cloth, Lieutenant. It's what we do while wearing it that matters. Keep flying, and keep bringing them home." "Yes, sir." As the plane touched down, the 4 F-22s pulled up and away in a graceful arc, climbing back into the sky. It was a classic missing man formation, a tribute reserved for the fallen or the honored few. The passengers burst into spontaneous applause that lasted for nearly a minute. David gathered his worn backpack and prepared to exit. As he walked down the aisle, passengers reached out to shake his hand or simply to touch his shoulder. He accepted each gesture with quiet grace. The young boy from row 8 held up a piece of paper. He had drawn a picture during the flight, a stick figure man with wings, surrounded by airplanes. "This is you," the boy said shyly. "You're my hero." David knelt down to the boy's level. "Thank you for this. I'll keep it safe. But remember, the real heroes are the ones who help others every single day. Teachers, doctors, firefighters, and parents. They're all heroes too." "Even my mom?" the boy asked. "Especially your mom." The boy beamed, and his mother mouthed a silent "thank you" to David. Richard Palmer stood as David passed. "Sir, I need to apologize. I judged you. I was wrong. I'm deeply sorry." David paused and looked at him. "We all judge too quickly sometimes, Mr. Palmer. What matters is what we do after we realize it. You seem like a man who can learn from his mistakes." Richard extended his hand, and David shook it firmly. "I won't forget this," Richard said. "I won't forget you." When David stepped into the terminal, Emma saw him immediately. She broke free from her grandmother's hand and ran, her shoes slapping against the polished floor. "Daddy!" David caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground in a hug that seemed to last forever. The news cameras captured the moment, but David didn't care. All that mattered was the little girl in his arms. "I missed you, little bird," he whispered. "I missed you too. Daddy, there were fighter planes. Did you see them?" "I saw them, sweetheart." "Why were they here? Were they looking for someone important?" David set her down and knelt so they were eye level. "Sometimes, Emma, the sky remembers things we try to forget. Those planes came to say hello to an old friend." "Were they your friends?" "In a way, yes." Emma's grandmother approached, her eyes red from crying. "David," she said, embracing him. "Welcome home." "Thanks, Mom. Sorry for all the commotion." She laughed through her tears. "Commotion? David, you've made national news. There are reporters everywhere." As they walked through the terminal hand in hand, David was aware of the stares and the whispers. Word had spread quickly. Several people pulled out phones to record them passing by. Airport security formed a loose perimeter around them, keeping the crowd at a respectful distance. The news crew approached, microphones extended. "Mr. Mitchell. Can we ask you some questions?" "No comment," David said politely but firmly. "Is it true you're Viper 1? The legendary pilot?" "I'm just a dad trying to get home with his daughter." "But sir, the people have a right to know." David stopped and turned to face the reporter directly. His voice was calm but carried authority. "Ma'am, I appreciate your job. But right now, my daughter needs her father. That's the only story that matters to me. I hope you understand." The reporter, surprisingly, nodded. "I do, sir. Thank you for your service." As they pushed through the doors into the cool evening air, Emma skipped beside him, chattering about school and her friends and the drawings she had made for him. David listened to every word, responding when appropriate, but mostly just enjoying the sound of her voice. This was what mattered. Not the formations or the salutes or the recognition. This moment right here. As they reached the parking garage, Emma tugged on his hand. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are you a hero?" David was quiet for a moment. He looked up at the darkening sky, where somewhere those 4 Raptors were returning to base. He thought about Commander Cole and the squadron he'd saved. He thought about all the missions, all the close calls, all the times he'd cheated death. Then he looked down at his daughter's upturned face and squeezed her hand gently. "No, Emma. Heroes are the people who keep going even when things are hard. Heroes are people like your grandmother who took care of you while I was gone. Heroes are teachers and nurses and people who help others every day without expecting anything in return." But those planes came just for you. Those planes came to say thank you. That's different from being a hero. I was just doing my job, trying to help people and make it home safely. But you saved people, right? The man on the plane said so. David knelt again, looking into his daughter's eyes, eyes that held all the innocence and hope in the world. Yes, I helped some people when they needed it. But Emma, the most important thing I ever did wasn't flying planes or going on missions. The most important thing I ever did was being your father. And the bravest thing I ever did was coming home to you instead of staying up there in the sky. Emma threw her arms around his neck. I'm glad you came home, Daddy. I'm so glad. Me too, little bird. Me too. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully in her room, David sat on the back porch of their small house. The sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed brighter than usual. Or maybe he was just seeing them differently now. His phone had been buzzing all evening with messages and calls from news outlets, military contacts, and even old squadron mates he hadn't heard from in years. He'd turned it off an hour ago. But before he did, he'd read one message from Commander Cole. Sir, this is Cole. I hope you don't mind, I got your number from the flight manifest. I wanted you to know that video from today's escort has gone viral. Millions of views. You're being called a hero all over the internet. The Pentagon has issued a statement confirming your service record and calling you one of the finest pilots in Air Force history. General Hawkins also wanted me to pass along that your service record has been updated to show you as honorably discharged with full benefits, effective immediately. They're talking about a medal ceremony. But knowing you, sir, I suspect you'll decline. Either way, you've earned it 1,000 times over. Thank you for everything you did for us. For all of us. Fly safe, sir. Cole. David smiled slightly and put the phone away. He didn't care about viral videos or Pentagon statements or medal ceremonies. He had what he needed right here. A soft sound made him turn. Emma stood in the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. Daddy? Why aren't you sleeping? Just thinking, sweetheart. Come here. She padded over and climbed into his lap, small arms wrapping around his neck. They sat together in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars. Daddy? Emma said after a while. Yes. Will you tell me a story? What kind of story? A story about flying. David thought for a moment, then began. Once upon a time, there was a pilot who loved to fly. He flew higher than the clouds and faster than the wind. He went on many adventures and helped lots of people. But you know what? What? Every single time he was up there in the sky, he was thinking about someone very special down here on the ground. Someone with dark hair and a bright smile. Someone who drew pictures for him and waited by the window. And that's how he always found his way home. Emma lifted her head to look at him. Was that person me? That person was definitely you. She smiled and nestled back against his chest. I like that story. Me too, little bird. Me too. They sat there until Emma fell asleep in his arms. David carried her back to her room and tucked her in carefully. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her breathe, thinking about how close he'd come to losing this. The missions, the danger, the constant deployment, it had all seemed so important at the time. But this, right here, this was what truly mattered. He thought about the young pilots he'd seen today, about Commander Cole and his gratitude, about Lieutenant Harris and her renewed sense of purpose. A new generation was protecting the skies now. They were good pilots, dedicated and skilled. They didn't need him anymore. But Emma did. As David finally stood to leave the room, he noticed a drawing on Emma's desk. She had drawn it while waiting for him to come home. It showed two stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. One was tall, one was small. Above them, she had written in careful letters, "My daddy. My hero. David picked up the drawing and held it carefully, his eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. Maybe being a hero wasn't about flying impossible missions or saving squadrons in hostile territory. Maybe being a hero was simply being there for the people who needed you most. He carried the drawing to his own room and placed it on the nightstand where he would see it first thing every morning. It would remind him of what he was fighting for now, not missions or medals, but moments. Quiet moments like these, filled with love and peace. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance across the sky. Somewhere up there, the pilots of those F-22s were probably back at Andrews, telling stories about the day they escorted a legend. But here, in this small house, in this quiet neighborhood, Colonel David Mitchell, call sign Viper 1, was exactly where he needed to be. Home. And tomorrow, he would wake up, make Emma breakfast, walk her to school, and live the most important mission of his life, being a father. That was the only rank that mattered now.